The morning sun burned white over the Mojave Desert as 8 Marine Scout snipers lay prone on the ridgeline, their rifles trained on a target 2,400 meters downrange. The wind was wrong. It had been wrong for 3 days. Every calculation, every adjustment, every breath hold had produced the same result. Near misses that kissed the dirt 6 inches left of center. Staff Sergeant Rake Hendrickson lowered his M40A6 and wiped the sweat from his eyes. Behind him, the observation team muttered into their notebooks. This was supposed to be routine validation shooting for the new battalion. Instead, it had become a spectacle of failure that would follow them back to 29 Palms. Colonel Vance stood 30 meters back with his arms crossed, watching through binoculars that cost more than most of the rifles on the line. Beside him stood a woman in faded coyote brown fatigues with no rank insignia visible, her hair pulled into a tight bun that revealed a face weathered by sun and years. She said nothing. She had been standing there since dawn, just watching, and her silence made Hendrickson angrier than any words could have. Winds gusting northeast at 7, shifting to 9, the spotter called out. Hendrickson made the adjustment and fired. The round snapped downrange with a crack that echoed off the desert floor. Through the scope, he watched the impact bloom in the dirt, left again. Always left. He heard one of the junior Marines curse under his breath. The woman stepped forward. Her boots crunched on the gravel and everyone turned to look. She was older, maybe 45, with crow's feet that framed pale green eyes. There was no arrogance in her movement, no theatricality. She simply walked to the line and knelt beside Hendrickson's rifle. "May I?" Her voice was quiet, almost apologetic. Hendrickson glanced at the colonel, who nodded. He moved aside, confused and irritated. Who was this? Some civilian contractor, a visiting instructor. She picked up the rifle like it was an old friend, checked the chamber, adjusted the scope by a single click, then another. She did not ask for the wind data. She did not ask for the range card. She settled into the dirt, her breathing slowing until it was barely visible. The entire line went silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. She fired once. The sound was different somehow, cleaner. Downrange, the steel target sang with a metallic ring that carried across 2,000 meters of empty desert. Dead center. Nobody spoke. The woman stood, brushed the dust from her knees, and handed the rifle back to Hendrickson. "You're compensating for a crosswind that isn't there anymore," she said softly. "The ridgeline creates a thermal updraft mid-flight. Aim a half-mil right and 1/4 down." She walked back to the colonel without waiting for a response. Hendrickson stared at the rifle in his hands like it had betrayed him. One of the junior Marines whispered, "Who the hell is that?" The colonel turned to leave and the woman followed. As they walked toward the Humvee parked on the access road, Hendrickson called out, "Ma'am, wait." She stopped but did not turn around. "What's your name?" For a moment she seemed to consider not answering. Then she glanced over her shoulder. "Callahan," she said. "Kit Callahan." The name meant nothing to him. She climbed into the passenger seat and the Humvee disappeared in a cloud of dust that hung in the air long after the engine noise faded. Back on the ridgeline, Hendrickson made the adjustment she had suggested. He fired. The target rang again. Then again. 5 shots, 5 hits. The other snipers crowded around him, demanding to know what he had changed. He told them, but nobody wanted to believe it. A civilian, a woman, had just solved a problem that 8 trained Marine Scout snipers could not. That night in the barracks, someone pulled out a laptop and started searching her name. What they found silenced the room. Kit Callahan, call sign Revenant, former Navy pilot with 3 combat deployments, 17 confirmed air-to-ground kills in Operation Iraqi Freedom, Silver Star recipient for a close air support mission in Fallujah that had saved an entire Marine platoon from being overrun. Retired after a medical discharge in 2009 following a helicopter crash in Afghanistan that killed her co-pilot. She had walked away with a shattered pelvis and burns across 40% of her body. The photos showed a younger woman in a flight suit, her face hard and confident beneath a helmet painted with a grinning skull. Revenant. Hendrickson closed the laptop and stared at the wall. The woman he had dismissed as some random contractor had more trigger time than his entire unit combined. The next morning, he found her standing alone near the flight line, watching a pair of Hornets take off from the airstrip. He approached slowly, unsure of what to say. "I looked you up," he admitted. She did not turn around. "And you were a pilot, fixed wing and rotary, combat decorations, Silver Star, Purple Heart. Why are you out here teaching snipers about wind?" She smiled, but it was sad. Because nobody asks pilots about wind anymore. They trust the computers. They trust the JDAM coordinates. They forget that physics doesn't care about your technology. She finally looked at him. "You want to know why I'm here? Because the Corps asked me to consult on long-range precision fires. Because even in retirement, I can't stop thinking about trajectories and angles and how to put steel on target. Because shooting is shooting, whether it's a Sidewinder or a bullet." Hendrickson nodded slowly. "The thermal updraft, how did you know?" "I flew low-altitude close air support for 6 years. You learn to read the desert. The way heat bends light. The way wind moves sand. The way air currents shift around terrain features. Your spotter was reading wind at ground level. But the bullet spends most of its flight in the air column above the ridgeline, where the thermals rise. You were aiming at a target through a mirage you couldn't see." It made perfect sense, and Hendrickson felt foolish for not seeing it himself. "Will you teach us?" She considered this. "I'm not a sniper." "No, ma'am, but you see things we don't." That afternoon, Kit Callahan returned to the range with a whiteboard and a marker. She drew diagrams of airflow and explained how temperature gradients affected bullet trajectory the same way they affected aircraft lift. She spoke in the calm, methodical tone of someone who had briefed missions under fire. The snipers listened. Some took notes. Others just watched her hands move across the board, sketching invisible rivers of wind that flowed over the landscape like water. By the end of the week, every Marine in the battalion knew her name, not because of her record, though that helped, but because she had done something rare in the military. She had taught without condescension. She had corrected without ego. She had proven herself not by demanding respect, but by earning it one quiet lesson at a time. When she left 29 Palms, the Marines lined up to shake her hand. Hendrickson was the last in line. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. "Shoot straight, Marine." Then she was gone. 3 months later, Hendrickson's platoon deployed to Syria. They were tasked with overwatch on a ridgeline outside Raqqa, providing sniper support for a joint operation to clear an ISIS stronghold. The wind was brutal, gusting, and unpredictable, swirling around the rocky hills in patterns that defied logic. Hendrickson remembered Kit's words. He watched the heat shimmer above the rocks. He adjusted right and down, compensating for the thermals. His first shot dropped an enemy fighter at 1,800 meters. His second took out a machine gun position. His third silenced a spotter on a rooftop. The platoon commander called it the best shooting he had ever seen. That night, Hendrickson sat on the ridgeline and looked up at the stars. Somewhere in California, Kit Callahan was probably asleep, unaware that her lessons had just saved lives halfway around the world. He wondered if she knew how many people she had taught over the years. How many pilots, how many Marines, how many soldiers carried her knowledge into combat. He wondered if she ever thought about the ripple effect of a single moment on a desert range, when she had picked up a rifle and shown a roomful of cocky snipers that competence has no gender. Back in the States, Kit Callahan woke to an email from Colonel Vance. It contained a single photograph: Hendrickson's platoon standing on a ridgeline in Syria, holding a hand-painted sign that read, "Revenant taught us to see the wind." She stared at the photo for a long time, then saved it to a folder on her desktop labeled, "Why I Still Do This." She poured herself coffee and walked out onto her porch, where the California morning was just beginning to warm. The sky was clear and infinite, the way it always looked from a cockpit at 20,000 feet. She thought about the young Marines she had met, their skepticism and their pride, and how quickly both had dissolved in the face of results. That was the thing about the military. It could be rigid and traditional and resistant to change, but it was also ruthlessly meritocratic when it mattered. If you could perform, if you could deliver, if you could put rounds on target or bombs on coordinates or ideas into action, then the rest fell away. Gender, age, background, all of it became irrelevant in the harsh light of competence. But it had not always been that way for her. Kit had joined the Navy in 1998, one of the first women allowed to fly combat missions after the 1993 policy change. She had endured the whispers, the hazing, the instructors who graded her harder because they were waiting for her to fail. She had proven herself in flight school, then again in the fleet, then again in combat. Each time the bar moved. Each time she cleared it. And each time she told herself it was the last time she would have to prove anything. She was wrong. Even after the Silver Star, even after the kills and the commendations and the respect of her squadron, there were still people who saw her as a token, a diversity hire, a political statement. It made her furious and exhausted in equal measure. So when the crash happened, when her helicopter went down in the mountains of Afghanistan and she spent 6 months in a hospital bed learning to walk again, part of her felt relief. She could retire. She could step away from the fight to be seen as an equal. She could finally rest. But the Corps had called her back. Not to fly, her injuries made that impossible, but to teach, to consult, to pass on the hard-won knowledge that had kept her alive through 3 deployments. At first she resisted. She was done proving herself. But then she realized that teaching was not about her anymore. It was about the next generation. The young pilots and Marines and soldiers who would face the same challenges she had, who would need the same skills and knowledge and resilience. If she could shorten their learning curve, if she could give them an edge, if she could save even one life with a lesson about thermals and wind, then it was worth coming back. So she taught. She traveled to bases across the country, working with units that requested her expertise. She taught pilots about low-altitude tactics. She taught forward air controllers about close air support. She taught snipers about environmental factors. And slowly, without fanfare or recognition, she became a legend in the small circles of people who knew what she had done. Not because of her record, though that helped, but because she showed up, because she cared, because she treated every student like they mattered. The sun climbed higher and Kit finished her coffee. Her phone buzzed with a text from Colonel Vance. "They want you back at 29 Palms next month. Advanced course. You interested?" She smiled. "Send me the dates," she replied. Then she went inside to check her calendar. The fight to be seen as an equal was never really over, but it got easier when you stopped fighting for yourself and started fighting for everyone who came after you. At 29 Palms, word of Kit Callahan's return spread through the base like wildfire. The Marines who had trained with her before told stories that grew more exaggerated with each retelling. She could shoot a rifle at 3,000 meters. She had shot down enemy aircraft with nothing but a pistol. She had walked out of a burning helicopter and still completed the mission. Most of it was nonsense, but the core truth remained. She was the real thing and she was coming back. When Kit arrived, she found the range packed with Marines. Not just snipers this time, but infantry, artillery, even a few pilots from the nearby air station. They all wanted to learn. She stood in front of them with her whiteboard and her quiet confidence, and she began to teach. She talked about wind and thermals, about bullet drop and mirage, about how the environment was always your first enemy and your best ally. She talked about the physics of flight and the geometry of trajectory. She talked about staying calm under fire and trusting your training when everything else failed. But she also talked about failure, about the missions that went wrong, the shots that missed, the decisions that cost lives. She talked about her crash in Afghanistan, about waking up in the wreckage and realizing her co-pilot was dead, about the guilt that followed her home, the nightmares, the long road of recovery. She talked about it not to seek sympathy, but to make a point. Everyone fails. Everyone bleeds. Everyone carries scars. The difference between good operators and great ones is what you do after the failure. Do you quit, or do you learn? The Marines listened in absolute silence. This was not the usual military instruction, full of bravado and machismo. This was something else. This was honesty. When she finished, a young corporal raised his hand. "Ma'am, how do you deal with it, the guilt?" Kit looked at him for a long moment. "You carry it," she said simply. "You carry it and you use it to make yourself better. You honor the people you lost by becoming the operator they needed you to be, and you never, ever stop learning." The training continued for 2 weeks. Kit worked with the Marines individually and in groups, tailoring her lessons to their needs. She spent hours on the range, watching them shoot, offering corrections, celebrating their successes. She ate in the chow hall with them, sat in on their after-action reviews, answered their questions no matter how basic or complex. And slowly something shifted. The Marines stopped seeing her as an outsider, a civilian, a relic from another era. They started seeing her as one of them, a warrior, a teacher, a legend. On her last day, the battalion held a small ceremony. Colonel Vance presented her with a plaque engraved with the battalion insignia and the words "Revenant, Teacher, Pilot, Marine." Kit accepted it with a smile that did not quite hide the emotion in her eyes. "I'm not a Marine," she said. "I was Navy." The colonel grinned. "Close enough." The room erupted in laughter and applause. Kit shook hands, accepted hugs, and promised to come back. Then she walked to her truck and drove away, leaving behind a battalion of Marines who would carry her lessons into every corner of the world. Months passed. Kit continued her work, traveling to new bases, teaching new students, refining her methods. She heard stories from the field, Marines using her techniques in Iraq, snipers making impossible shots in Afghanistan, pilots adjusting their tactics based on her lessons. Each story was a small victory, a confirmation that her work mattered. But she never sought recognition. She never asked for credit. She just kept teaching, kept sharing, kept giving back to the community that had given her so much. Then one day she received a letter. It was handwritten, postmarked from North Carolina, and signed by a Marine she did not recognize. The letter told a story about a firefight in Helmand Province, a sniper team pinned down by enemy fire, a shot that seemed impossible. The Marine had remembered Kit's lesson about thermals and wind. He had adjusted right and down, compensating for the heat shimmer above the rocks. The shot had landed true, 2,200 meters, dropping the enemy machine gunner and breaking the ambush. The letter ended with 4 words: "You saved my life." Kit read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in her desk drawer alongside dozens of others. She did not cry, though she wanted to. Instead, she walked out onto her porch and looked up at the sky. The sun was setting, painting the clouds in shades of orange and red. She thought about all the young men and women she had taught, all the lives she had touched, all the bullets that had flown true because someone remembered a lesson about wind. This, she realized, was her legacy. Not the medals or the kills or the commendations, not the silver star gathering dust in a box somewhere. But this, the quiet knowledge that somewhere in the world, a Marine was alive because she had taken the time to teach them how to read the desert. That was worth more than any award. That was worth the pain and the scars and the long road back from the crash. That was why she kept doing this. The sky darkened and the stars appeared, bright and infinite. Kit stood on her porch for a long time, watching the night settle over the California hills. Somewhere, a young Marine was looking at the same stars, carrying her lessons into the fight. And somewhere beyond them, in the great unknown, her co-pilot was watching too. She hoped he was proud. She hoped he knew that his death had not been in waste, that she had taken the pain of that loss and turned it into something useful, something good. She hoped he knew that she had not given up. The next morning, Kit woke to another email from Colonel Vance. This one was different. It was not a request for training. It was an invitation. The Marine Corps was holding a ceremony at Quantico to honor instructors who had made significant contributions to combat readiness. They wanted to honor Kit. They wanted to give her the title of Honorary Marine, a rare recognition given to civilians who embody the core values. Kit stared at the email for a long time. Honorary Marine. She had never wanted recognition, never sought titles, but this felt different. This was the Corps saying, "You are one of us." She accepted. 3 months later, she stood on a parade ground at Quantico, wearing a suit instead of fatigues, surrounded by Marines in dress blues. The commandant himself presented her with a certificate and a challenge coin engraved with the eagle, globe, and anchor. He spoke about her service, her sacrifice, her contributions. He spoke about the lives she had saved, the Marines she had trained, the legacy she had built. When he finished, the entire formation came to attention and saluted. Kit, a Navy veteran who had never worn Marine Corps rank, returned the salute with tears streaming down her face. Afterward, Marines lined up to meet her. Some she recognized from 29 Palms. Others were strangers who had heard the stories. They thanked her. They shook her hand. They asked for advice and shared their own experiences. And Kit listened to every one of them because that was what teachers did. They listened. They learned. They adapted. The ceremony ended, but the conversations continued into the evening. By the time Kit left Quantico, she had a dozen new email addresses, a dozen new connections, a dozen new opportunities to make a difference. The drive home was long and quiet. Kit stopped at a diner somewhere in Virginia and ordered coffee and pie. She sat in a corner booth and watched the other patrons, truckers and families and travelers, living their ordinary lives, unaware of the wars being fought on their behalf. She thought about the Marines she had met, their youth and their courage, and she felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the opportunity to serve, even in retirement. Gratitude for the chance to teach, to mentor, to give back. Gratitude for the hard-won knowledge that every scar, every failure, every moment of pain could be transformed into something meaningful if you refused to give up. She paid the check and continued driving. The sun was setting again, casting long shadows across the highway. Kit turned on the radio and found a station playing old rock songs from the 90s. She sang along quietly, tapping her fingers on the steering wheel, feeling more at peace than she had in years. The fight to be seen as an equal was over. She had won not by demanding recognition, but by earning it through decades of excellence and quiet service. And now, finally, she could simply be. Not a female pilot, not a token, not a diversity hire, just Kit Callahan, revenant, teacher, Marine. When she arrived home, the house was dark and empty. She turned on the lights and unpacked her bag. The certificate from Quantico went on the wall next to her silver star and her purple heart. The challenge coin went in a glass case alongside others she had collected over the years. She poured herself a drink and stood in front of the wall, looking at the artifacts of her life. Each one represented a moment, a mission, a memory. But they were just objects. The real legacy was out there, in the hearts and minds of the Marines she had taught, the lives she had saved, the knowledge she had passed on. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Hendrickson, now a gunnery sergeant deployed somewhere in Africa. Heard about Quantico. Congrats, Revenant, you earned it. Kit smiled and replied, just doing my job, Gunny, stay safe. She set the phone down and finished her drink. Then she walked out onto her porch one more time into the cool California night. The stars were bright, the air was still, and for the first time in a long time, Kit Callahan felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Years would pass. Marines would deploy and return, carrying her lessons into every theater of war. Some would remember her name, others would not, but all of them would carry a piece of her knowledge, a fragment of her experience, a sliver of her legacy. They would adjust for thermals on ridgelines in Syria. They would compensate for wind in the mountains of Afghanistan. They would trust their training when the bullets started flying. And in those moments when the shot had to be perfect and the stakes could not be higher, they would hear her voice in their heads. Aim right and down. Trust the physics. Breathe. And the shots would land true. The missions would succeed. The Marines would come home. And somewhere in a quiet house in California, Kit Callahan would receive another letter, another email, another message of thanks. She would read them all. She would save them all. And she would know with absolute certainty that she had done what every warrior dreams of doing. She had made a difference. Not through glory or fame or recognition, but through the simple, profound act of teaching one person at a time how to survive, how to excel, how to be better than they thought possible. That was her legacy. That was her gift. That was why she kept going, even when her body ached and her scars throbbed and the nightmares came back. Because somewhere out there, a young Marine was alive because she had refused to quit, because she had chosen to teach instead of retire, because she had taken her pain and turned it into purpose. And that in the end was the only thing that mattered, not the medals, not the rank, not the recognition. Just the knowledge that she had served, and that her service had meant something. The sky above California stretched on forever, infinite and unburdened, the same sky she had flown through decades ago when she was young and invincible and convinced she could change the world. She had been wrong about the invincibility. The crash had taught her that. But she had been right about changing the world. One shot at a time. One lesson at a time. One Marine at a time. That was how you changed the world. Not through grand gestures or heroic sacrifices, but through the quiet accumulation of small, meaningful actions that rippled outward in ways you could never fully measure or understand. Kit Callahan, call sign Revenant, stood on her porch and smiled. The night was beautiful, the stars were bright, and tomorrow she would wake up and do it all over again. Because that was what warriors did. They served, they taught, they carried on, and they never ever stopped fighting for the people who came after them. That was the code, that was the calling, that was the legacy. And as long as she had breath in her lungs and knowledge in her mind, she would honor it until the very end.